And we're back. Welcome again to another great episode. And I'm going to tell you, this is a serious episode, like other episodes of Inside Out, Exploring the Roads to Redemption. I'm your co host, Dr. Lawrence, and I'm the founder and executive director of A Bridge to Light, where we facilitate disrupting the school of prison pipeline and enabling the reentry of formerly incarcerated persons. And it's my pleasure and honor to be joined with my brother and friend, Mr. Thomas Cotton.
Welcome back, everyone. I'm glad you guys are joining us. Again, I'm Thomas Cotton, founder and CEO of Redemption and Advancement Alliance, where our mission is to disrupt the cycles of incarceration by helping the main part of the process achieve a new life by creating a blueprint, and that's the person that's involved, the center of reentry. So welcome.
I tell you, Thomas, every time you get to the end of that part, the center of your work is the person, the people, the community. So, I mean, it's not actually the work itself, it's how is the work affecting the person, the individual,
Right.
especially tailored to enable that person to navigate the complexities of life. So every time you say that, man, it just fires me up. Thomas and I, we met about a year and a half, about 2 years ago, at Morehouse School of Medicine online program, the Justice Involved course, the Masters of Justice Involved course. And shout outs to Morehouse School of Medicine for having the innovation and just the forethought in creating such a powerful course to arm Thomas and I and others like us, just understanding the effects that marginalized communities, namely those who have been affected, justice impacted or justice involved persons, the system and so forth. And Thomas, you have a very unique perspective with Morehouse itself and with the program. So if you could just take us through a little bit of that, so we appreciate it.
Yeah, when I jumped into the MAGIC program, is what it's called, the Justice Involved Care program, it really spoke to exactly who I am as far as the care of the individual. We're not talking about criminal justice here. We're not talking about criminality. We're talking about justice involved care because there are people who need care on the outside of incarceration when they're changing their life. They don't need to go through criminal justice and continue to be criminalized through this process. So the term injustice involved person uh, is what we're looking at. So justice involved refers to the person who has currently been involved with the criminal justice system, or they've been arrested, charged, convicted, incarcerated, on probation, on parole. It's the individual that interacts with the justice involved system. And so when we talk about justice involved care, we're looking at the person, the individual. But there's also justice impacted people. And
Hmm.
justice impacted people are those directly involved with the justice system. So that does include a justice involved person, but it also can encompass family members, community, individuals who are disproportionately affected by policing and incarceration, and individuals who face societal consequences such as difficulties to employment, housing due to criminal records or just where they're from. And so it emphasizes the broader impact of the justice system toward individuals and communities. So when we think of justice involved, we're centering around the discussion around individuals, actions, and legal status. When we talk about justice impacted people, we're
Yes, sir.
looking at the wider societal personal consequences that the justice system reaches.
Justice involved and justice impacted. And Thomas, you did an excellent job just characterizing both camps so we can clearly understand or have a better understanding. So I'm sure there are certain agencies or institutions that may characterize it differently, but at least we've given
Mhm.
our viewers a point of departure. So when they do go into these conversations, they can start the conversation from a known point. And that's this
Yeah.
program. This program here on Inside Out. And Inside Out, our purpose here, Inside Out, exploring the roads to redemption, is to address or illuminate the issues that the justice impacted and justice involved persons and communities uh, may may encounter when in reentering society. So that's very, very important. And thank you so very much, Thomas, for again
Yeah.
clearly articulating the difference between the two. Before we go any further, though, we gotta encourage you. We gotta encourage you because there's I won't say there's no, but there's very few platforms. There are very few platforms that are speaking to this topic, the justice impacted, justice involved, the road to redemption. There are very few. So we ask you to share, like, engage, subscribe to this platform because nowhere or very few places speak to these unique topics that we speak about, and it all came from the Morehouse School of Morehouse School of Medicine's Magic program. So big shout outs to that group of people who had the foresight to actually create this program, and which led to Thomas and I getting to know each other and putting on this podcast. Tonight, though, is a very, very important topic. Tonight, we we want to examine violence. We want to understand violence and its impact on marginalized communities, namely the justice impacted, justice involved community. So I may ask you, what is violence? The reason why I'm asking you what is violence, because in our society, based on the access of information, based on the access through social media, through the 24-hour news cycle, through entertainment and music, we are bombarded by various forms of violent activities to the point where they're stitched in our laws. So there's several definitions of violence, but I like this one, and I would like to arm you, and as we speak tonight about a unique type of violence, so we can make meaning of the environment in which we live. Violence is the intentional use of physical force, and we kind of know that already. The intentional use of physical force or power, threatened or actual, against oneself. So I can actually be violent towards myself, another person, or against a group or community that either results in or has a high likelihood of resulting in injury, death, psychological harm, maldevelopment, or deprivation. So it doesn't have to really injure you physically, but it could prevent you. It can have a form of deprivation and or maldevelopment to further put place you at a disadvantage. And there's various forms of violence: physical violence, sexual violence, financial violence that one could look at. So when I speak about that, Thomas, what are some of our thoughts when we think about the justice impacted community, justice involved community? What are some of your thoughts, sir, as I read that definition?
So when I think about the definition of violence, and as you're reading that, there's a few that stand out. Like a lot of times when we think about violence, we think about the person who's physical, who's creating harm toward another person through some type of physical action. But there's so many other psychological, emotional violence. I used to teach racial relationship enhancement classes, and we had a whole section on sexual violence and then economic violence also. When you think of the types of violence that are out there, one of the things we have to remember is violence is a precursor to trauma. And
Mm,
so when we have the violence being a precursor to trauma, and we know what trauma does to people, we have to recognize that any context of violence is going to create a person that's going through some trauma, and that trauma is going to cause them to think a certain way,
right.
and it's going to cause them to not think rationally, as a lot of people try to do. Is they try to rationalize people who are in violent situations, and they try to make them, well, if you just did this, and they simplify, and we talk about oversimplification of a
Mm,
situation,
wow.
because there's so much more that goes behind it. And as we talk about violence today, we're going to recognize how violence, in the structural sense,
Mm,
really keeps people in a place, because their mindsets aren't thinking in the right aspect. And so when I think of types of violence, physical violence is definitely prevalent in communities that we're talking about. It's
Right.
prevalent in those who are just as impacted. And it is one of those things that it trickles down to the psychological, to the sexual, to
Mm.
the economic, and so
Right.
many other ways. So we want to make sure that we highlight and understand that violence is not just a physical act. It is something that is much larger that causes trauma to people, which then, begets more violence.
Right. Right. You hit on something as far as the larger aspect of violence, and we may see like the outcome or the result based on physical, sexual, emotional uh, activity against a party, a group, and so forth. But in that definition, the deprivation and maldevelopment, and the force, one's ability of force to do that. I'm reminded of Johann Galtung's triangle of violence. If we envision a triangle, if we can envision a triangle, and the triangle of violence, Galtung's triangle of violence has three parts like any other triangle. On one side, you have what they call structural violence. On another side of the triangle, you have cultural violence. And then in the very top of the triangle, you have physical or direct action violence, or direct violence. The violence below the direct violence is invisible. And I think that this is what Thomas was hinting to as far as the structural violence. The structural violence, and that's what we're going to look at tonight specifically. In our later shows, we want to see what's the relationship between the cultural violence and structural violence, and what's the relationship between direct violence and cultural violence and structural violence. So, in a nutshell, you have the structural violence. The structural violence are laws, policies, practices, or an unequal distribution of resources to a group because of their identity. For example, Jim Crow. Jim
Mm.
Crow, because you were black, you couldn't access these resources, or you had to go to another place to access these resources. So how do we understand it when addressing the justice impacted or justice involved community? And we're going to go deeper in that tonight. Cultural violence is the stories we tell ourselves based on the policies, procedures, and the distribution of resources about the stories we tell ourselves. Well, blacks, they can't resource these resources. They can't access these because they're stupid, they're lazy, they're this, they're that. So these are the stories we tell ourselves, or the stories that are implanted in particular communities to justify the physical violence. So we have the structural violence, the cultural violence, the stories we tell ourselves, which justify the physical violence. But with that, we're going to focus just on structural violence tonight. We're going to focus on structural violence and its effects on the justice involved person. Like, for example, Thomas and I were talking about constitutional rights. We all have constitutional rights. And I believe is it the Second Amendment, Thomas? The right to bear a weapon or right to bear
Right to
arms?
bear arms. Yep.
Okay. So can you take us further with respect to structural violence, and one being marked as a justice impacted person, or as they would call a few years ago, a felon in their ability to exercise their constitutional rights?
Yeah. So when it comes to structural violence, and okay, I know I committed a crime. I know that it's been almost 30 years since the last time I've been arrested. I know that still today impacts me. So we think about the political structural violence. Okay, so yes, am I supposed to pay the rest of my life for something I did as a teenager? Probably not. I shouldn't. But the reality is, I still must follow certain rules and laws, because here's the crazy part: as a formerly incarcerated federal felon, if I get caught with a firearm right now, that's automatic 15 years.
Mm,
And for each bullet that's in that gun, there's 5 extra years.
Come on.
So if I have a gun with a 6-round clip and one in the chamber, I have to go back and do 50 years in prison.
Ooh. Yes, sir.
50 years. And it's written. And
Wow.
so when I think about this structural violence, that does not allow me to really fully reintegrate back into society
Mm,
as somebody who has paid my time, has rehabilitated, has
mm.
now made significant impact in this community,
Yes, sir.
far beyond what most people would do in their own normal lives without the felonies. And so we talk about these structural disadvantages, the social stigmatization that goes on. And so there's this disadvantage that I'm at because of the way the structure is set up. There's this stigma that follows me for the rest of my life. You got to realize it's 22 years old last time I was arrested. I just turned 52. And so that's a big difference. You can look at the last 24 years of my life and clearly see there's something different.
Yes, sir.
Um, and so when I think about, when we talk about structural violence and things that lead to unequal access to resources, opportunities, and rights, that's the other thing, the rights that we should have as a nation. That structural impact, it's violent toward the person because it makes them feel as if they're less than. And most people want to agree that a person that has been incarcerated is less than who they are. The problem with that is we all have something that we could have been accused of, whether it's drunk driving, whether
Yes.
it's
Yeah.
it's something I did as a kid and got away with. There's all types of things, and so we can't look down at other people and think that no, you're at a point where you can't get things restored.
Right.
Now, I do understand different states have different rules for restoring rights and everything else. But as on the federal level, you have to get a pardon from the president and so many other approvals through ATF and different other things in order to just get certain rights back, which should be constitutionally given to a person,
Right.
and not taken away. And so that structural violence, it limits a lot of different things, and again leads to unequal access and resources.
Yeah. As you were talking, I was thinking about the 1994, the Violent Crime Control and Law Enforcement Act. Uh,
Hmm.
because you went to jail and you were found guilty of a crime and you became a felon. You were not when you re-entered society. You were not able to get you were not able to get Pell grants while you were inside
Right.
the facility. You're not able to get on some public health, public aid as far as welfare, and also uh, the distribution of sentencing with
Mm.
respect to crack cocaine
Right.
and powder cocaine.
Right.
The distribution of sentencing because uh, because of one possessing this versus that, and they're essentially the same thing. But this it appears that this substance was more prolific in Black and Brown communities.
Yeah.
Therefore, many of our brothers and sisters that got caught in the early '90s, late '90s with these drugs served unique sentences in comparison to their counterparts who were not Black.
Yeah. The
Yes, sir.
100-to-1 ratio is, something I'm highly familiar with. And what that is, um, crack was 100 times worse than cocaine in sentencing. So 5 grams of crack is equal to 500 grams of cocaine. 500 grams of cocaine is half a kilo of cocaine. And so it's like you have 5 grams, and 5 grams of crack is smaller than a dime. It's the size of, I can't even, it's small. And so
Yes.
you start to think about the 5 grams of crack. And it's been years since I've even dealt in crack and so many other things. But uh, The idea that a person who can sell 100 times more cocaine, which is the base of what crack is. Crack is cocaine base. The base of cocaine base is cocaine. And so without cocaine, crack goes away.
Mm,
And people want to not look at the logic behind that. That is simple logic. They want to
yes.
bring in chemists and everybody else and break down what the chemistry of crack is and how it impacts the people and in so many other things and talk about the chemistry. But the simplicity of it is, without cocaine, there is no crack. And
Wow.
so, why do you want to punish the outcome more than the root? Here's the root cause and here's the outcome. Get rid of cocaine, there's no crack. There's no reason to punish people.
Mm,
But because it is at an 88% rate of those who are arrested for crack cocaine are African Americans, 88%. Therefore, to me, I start looking at the 13th Amendment, and I start
mm,
looking at the way you create slavery. I look
mm,
at I look at these sentences that they have within the federal prison system, and now you have people who dealt with, matter of fact, who were just around people who dealt crack.
yeah.
I have a person in my responsibility, and thank God he was able to get out after 26 years of prison, but he never sold anything. He was with us. And because he was with us, he didn't do anything. And because he didn't do anything, he decided to go to trial. But because we're on a conspiracy, just the knowledge of this criminal activity, he had knowledge of it, not participation, went to trial and got a life sentence.
Mm,
And if the laws didn't change, this man would be still in prison to this day. And fortunately, the laws shifted a few years back, and he was able to get out of prison after 26 years for doing nothing. That is a structural, violent occurrence that everyone sits back and lets happen.
yes, sir.
And the reality is, when I think about this, it's all the things we're talking about, these structural violent things. This is the reason why I do what I do. I have a responsibility to the people who are doing 26 years in prison for nothing, for just being around people. But not only that, even if I was selling drugs, and I told you about a man that I met in prison, and the first guy I walked up on, and he asked me how much time I had. And I told him 10 years, and I asked him how much time he had, and he said double life plus 40. And I said, well, what did you do? Man, I was selling crack.
Wow.
Double life plus 40, not killing somebody. And so that means that you're going to do a life sentence on top of a life sentence. And just so if you miss, get rid of those life sentences, you still have 40 years you got to do.
Come on. Come on.
And so when we start thinking about the structural violence and we start thinking about the crack and 100 to 1 ratios, and the ratio is different now. I'm not up on the laws now. I just know it's different. I look into it, say, because there's so much that we have to deal with structurally that's out here. I don't have time to keep going backwards and looking at these laws and trying to undo these laws. We need to start helping people within these structural violent areas in order to help them elevate so that they can disrupt those cycles of incarceration,
Yes.
and not find themselves at the
Well,
mercy of these courts.
excellent. Excellent. We rocking and rolling tonight, y'all. We rocking and rolling tonight. Hey, before we go any further, I want you to like, share, subscribe, engage, especially on this topic. Especially on this topic. Tonight, we're looking at violence. And we're trying to make meaning of violence, by through the lens of Johann Galtung's triangle of violence, which consists of structural violence, cultural violence, and direct violence. And tonight we're looking specifically through the prism of structural violence, and we'll later get to the cultural and direct piece. But as Thomas was talking, he was speaking about the unequitable or equal distribution of laws, of power. to facilitate deprivation, maldevelopment, sometimes psychological harm with some of these sentences and so forth, because you had a particular identity, because you are or a particular person doing a particular thing, but another person doing the same thing did not receive the same type of treatment. So that's structural violence. So when we understand, we overlay this model against life. Now we can make meaning of life in the violent activities, especially as they are committed against the justice impacted, justice involved community, returning citizens, and so forth. And with that, you know, how does that affect one's self esteem or self worth? When, as Thomas mentioned, you've served your time, you were held accountable, you served your time, and because you wear this title, because this box is checked, you're unable to access the rest of the room, the rest of the world. You're denied, fully qualified, but you're denied because this box is checked. That affects one's self worth, self esteem, and it may influence them to reoffend or recidivate. Thomas, anything, Thomas?
Yeah, so I was just thinking about something that you were saying, unable to access certain things. When you talk about structural violence, there's a limitation of educational access.
Mhm.
There's an impact on your family. There's different laws that are created because the fear that's put out there. Anyone who's soft on crime now, no, you can't be our in our Congress. You cannot represent us on being a soft on crime. But I think about you and I, right? Um, and the limitations I have within because of my background. But where we start at, even in the communities we started off with, the educational limitations.
Yes, sir.
You and I had those same educational limitations,
That's right.
right? And then, we have the same, we look at our communities and we say, well, wow, all our community, there's a strain there's oppressive forces that are just there. And there's this stress, this emotional stress. And then, we start thinking, we don't know at the time the systemic and policy issues that are creating these things.
Right. Right.
We could go back and look at history and think about redlining and different other things. And now we can see the policy and systemic issues and systematic ways of keeping things a certain way. But we don't realize that when structural things take place, such as redlining wasn't just about keeping you out of certain neighborhoods, it was keeping you in certain neighborhoods. And
Right.
within those certain neighborhoods, you had limited resources.
Yes.
So if you've ever gone into any kind of hood, you look around at the hood, it's different. It's the hood. Why? Because there's a little bit more trash around. Everything looks a little bit, more broken down than in certain neighborhoods. Well, think about the effects of redlining, keeping you in a neighborhood, keeping trash service out of those neighborhoods, keeping resources out of those neighborhoods. So it wasn't just keeping you out of the spaces and places that you couldn't live. It was
Yes.
keeping you in the places that were getting broken down and torn down at the same time. And so those limitations that are there, and now you're making it hard. You're adding this strain and this stress and this trauma and everything else, and you want everybody to come out of those situations flying sky high. Now, we're fortunate, you and I, we were able to go through two different situations. You went through the military, and I went through prison.
Yes, sir.
Through the prison, I was able to now reset my bearings because I made a choice. Whether I didn't care if my life ended here or anything, I'm not going out the same exact way I
Yes.
came in. So I was able to make these changes. Now we think about, why should these structural limitations be changed? Why should we look at this structural violence in a different way?
Yeah.
Because I'm not I'm not the only example of doing this, but there are so many other people who can't do what I'm doing
That's right.
because of these structural things.
That's right.
But if they were given opportunities to make these transitions and changes, then what's possible? Well, we start to realize that people are people. We have abilities.
Mhm.
And the reason why I keep referring back to you and I is because there's something we have in common. We both went through this magic program and we
Yes.
both came out of it 4.0s. Not everybody who came through this came out 4.0s, but we both had the same structural limitations from the beginning.
Yes,
We
sir.
both had our transitional challenges throughout life. And we both came back with a renewed vigor for education, for things that structurally were not our strengths in the past.
Amen.
Because structurally in the way things were, this wasn't the way we started off.
That's right.
But now where we're at today is we've led this program well. We're here on this podcast educating our people well. And we have to realize that these structural issues, whatever side you sit on, are should not be in place to hold people down. And that this is a violent act toward a people.
Oh, Thomas, I'll tell you what, you just gave a graduate lecture. A graduate lecturer, any Morehouse School of Medicine magic student that's watching this podcast, I don't suggest that you plagiarize it. That'll be bad. But there's so many nuggets. The criminal justice student, the healthcare student, the justice involved care student, the magic student. There's so many nuggets being dropped here. This is a graduate level discussion tonight. And please, these discussions are not being conducted in a lot of graduate courses. They're just not. But we're having it. And Thomas, you mentioned about structural violence, and you imply the impact it has on positive outcomes given the social determinants of health, i.e., healthcare, i.e., education, occupation, one's social environment, physical environment. Because you are of this particular identity, you are in this environment, and based on the resources, the unequal distribution of resources in that environment, that's a structurally violent environment. It's funny you should mention environmental racism because I'm currently reading a book, Clean and White, A History of Environmental Racism. I
Right.
can't make this up in America. Not my words, but it's Carl A. Zimmering's words. Okay, these are his words. So I encourage you, wherever you are out there, pick up the book, and it speaks to environmental racism. It speaks to redlining. It speaks to how we categorize certain people in different communities. And as you also suggested, in these environments, when they're so depressed and challenged, what does it do for me psychologically? How does it affect my vision to not only transform myself but to transform my environment? When you see the borders of your environment, you can't get outside of the borders of your environment because the only thing you see is despair. Then this has an effect on you.
Right.
So it affects your self-esteem and self-worth, which can give birth to frustration, which can give birth to offending or reoffending, i.e., recidivating.
Right.
Wow.
It's so interesting that as we're talking through this and, some of the things that we talked about before, violence begets trauma, period. If you're involved with any violent act, any source of violence, it is going to create trauma. It's going to create strain. It's going to contribute to low self esteem. It's going to cause certain things to happen. The the parts that often make me shake my head, I want to say something else. It's just stupid. um, the parts that are just stupid to me is that research has been done that shows that households that have been, or people that have been impacted by violence respond this way. They know it. They know that there are many different challenges and how much support we need to do and restorative justice and restorative care and all these other things for people who've been impacted by violence. For some reason, people in underserved communities don't get that same leverage. They don't get that same care. It's been proven and studied that fathers that are not in the house, that those households have more challenges than households that have fathers in them. And it's been proven. And it's been, but okay, so now let's say we have this structural violence that leads to this trauma, that leads to this desperation, that leads to survival mode, and people making bad decisions. Now fathers are taken out of the house. Now these households are disrupted. And so it just keeps going on. It keeps the cycle going. And no one steps back and says, wait a minute, we know that these things are taking place, but we're not identifying the structural violence that continue to contribute to these causes, and we're not going to do anything about that because we're going to say we're not going to handle the root again. We're going to just, this is the fruit, we're not going to worry about the root, we'll just deal with the root, I mean the fruit of stuff. And it's hard when you still have something, it's hard to breathe if a water hose is firing water in your mouth at the same time.
Right.
And all I'm saying is structural violence is that water hose that keeps you in desperation to just try to breathe.
Yeah.
And in sense, that's why we see all this disruptiveness, these problems in our communities. And we have people who are now jumping on the side of the structural aspect of it and saying, yeah, those people need to do something. Those people need to pull themselves up by their bootstraps. Those people, them people. And reality is, no, we need to turn this water off so they can breathe for a little bit, and then begin to recreate new systems that they can involve themselves with and change and transform things on their own.
Wow. Wow. I tell you, Tom, you know, structural violence woven into policies, into laws, into practices, into institutions. Okay, and there is a relationship between power and the status quo. To do nothing, as you mentioned, they studies have been conducted and have shown if we just add a little bit of more of this, a little more of that, and support here and support there, we can transform environments. Maybe not overnight, but we can have a strategy, a plan to transform environments to be more to have more access to social determinants of health. However,
Mhm.
the balance of power, the balance of power, because when you do that, when you take away from here and add to there, it affects the balance of power. And one's supporters may not be so in favor of that.
Right.
You take away from Paul to pay Peter, it doesn't work that way.
You know,
So,
one good example,
yes, sir.
I'm just going to jump in. I'm sorry.
Go ahead,
One good
man.
example is that defunding the police. You know, you're going to take away from this to fund all these other programs. And the reality is, you can't just do away with, defunding the police. There's different structures that you can set up for policing that allow more funds to be or funds to be given to them and to something else. But to totally think that you're going to defund the police and do away with this structural system, it's almost a lot of people are not going to buy that because not everybody thinks the same way about police. And so a lot of times when we think about like what you're saying, there are ways and people that are behind these structures, and you're going to the balance of power and the transference of power from one place to the next is a gradual process. It's not a just do away with something. It's a create a new cycle for other people to be a part of. And don't try to re fight against the system. I'll say that if you see systemic injustice and systematic injustice, fight against it. Keep fighting. But there needs to be also another place that people have another opportunity, and so you need to create new systems. And so Harriet Tubman was fighting against slavery. She created a new system that allowed people to flee, and when they got to the places that they fled to, there was new opportunities for them. It
Yes.
wasn't the same opportunities. It wasn't, you know, we're going to fight against this system and we're going to create new the same system when you get out of slavery. No, it's going to be different. And so we have to create these new systems. We have to create a mechanism that funnels people to these new systems while fighting the injustice that's there.
Wow. Well, I tell you tonight, although we've talked over the last 20 minutes or 20 plus minutes about structural violence, this is just an introduction. By no means have we exhausted just the full body of structural violence. I mean, there's volumes written on structural violence, on cultural violence, on direct violence. We're just introducing this topic to help us as a community, as a watching community, to understand the environments in which we live in. But yeah, I tell you something, Thomas. Whenever you say social injustice or health inequity, you're inherently saying structural violence.
Exactly.
You're
That's correct.
inherently saying it. You're whatever social injustice or health inequity a group is facing, the reentry group, the incarcerated community, those who are reentering society, justice impacted, you name it, whatever community that is facing social injustice or health inequities, inherently there is a structural violent activity taking place against that group. Period. Period. I tell you, Thomas, tonight has been very, very, very informative for me, and I appreciate us speaking about this. Violence, the triangle of violence, Gal Tung's triangle of violence, speaking to, and again, just an introduction of structural violence. In our next show, we'll talk about cultural violence, how it validates against the stories that we tell ourselves. Stories are implanted in communities to further validate direct violence against a particular group. We'll go deeper into that in our next show with respect to cultural violence and its relationship with both structural and direct violence. So to recap, we spoke about violence, we defined violence, and please go back and engage us with that. We spoke about, we defined violence. We spoke about the triangle of violence and the relationship of the triangle of violence with marginalized communities and or um, returning citizens, justice impacted persons, justice involved persons. Do you have anything else to share, Thomas?
No, I just want to make sure that people like, subscribe, and share. And I also want to just let our listeners know that hey, if you hear something and you don't agree, it's okay to disagree. Drop it in the chat. Let's have a dialogue about that because the reality is not everybody's going to see things a certain way, but we have to recognize that there are people out here who are it's not that they want to be in bad situations. It's that they started off from the bottom or from bad situations. And now they're trying to work themselves into better situations. And structural violence often prevents them from being able to do that.
Yeah,
And
because
so we just have to remember that that's out there
because of who they are,
just
simply
because who they are.
because of age, because of class, because of their station, just simply because of who they are, there are laws, there are barriers, there are obstacles to prevent them from achieving their vision.
Mm-hmm.
Wow. Hey, Thomas, this has been very, very just educational, and thank you for being our co-host. And I'm grateful for being your co-host. So with that, everyone and everything is a resource. It takes a network of progression. It takes a network of progression to defeat networks of oppression. So let's make the net work.
And as long as a person has a heartbeat, there's an opportunity for redemption. So let us remember that people are people and they just need that opportunity to be able to redeem themselves, given the resources, given the opportunities, and also just being able to see themselves as human, humanizing them, and dignity, restoring their dignity. So thank you all for joining us.
Thank you. Have a good night.